Good evening, everybody. This is Father Patrick here for this week's edition of Asked and Answered. It's actually my first Asked and Answered, and we have a fun question this week. So this week, the question is wondering about Adam and Eve. Were Adam and Eve like the cavemen? Did they evolve? So this is actually something that I've been pretty interested in. Just the idea of evolution and creation and how those two things work together. And there's lots of theories. There's lots of speculation, lots of ways of trying to explain how did all this stuff happen. And there's lots of good theories. I think what's maybe most important though is to not speculate, but to maybe focus on like what do we know is true. What do we know has to be true because of either the faith and just what we know about mankind and what we are. So what we do know is that, number one, God created everything out of nothing. There was nothing, and then God created all that exists, the world, all the different galaxies and planets and everything. God created everything out of nothing. That is uncontestable. We know that to be true. And we know that God created the soul directly. So what makes man particular is that he has a rational soul. He can think about himself. He can reflect on these great mysteries that we're talking about right now. And so that means that because man is the only one that can do that, there's something greater there, right? So that shows you that man and his capacity for knowledge, his capacity for the infinite, that he can even think that there's a God out there, that's something greater. That couldn't just kind of spring out. That has to come directly from God himself. So the mechanisms of how God created and how animals and plants and all the different forms of life came to be, there's lots of ways that could have happened. God created perhaps through these natural mechanisms. He doesn't always just magically zap in and poof something out just poof something there. He uses the natural processes that he in fact created to bring greater things into existence. So it all has its ultimate origin in God. So he ultimately comes back to created everything. Even if it wasn't directly, it may have been indirectly through these processes. That's called secondary causality, if you want to know the philosophical term. But the soul of man is particularly important. That has to come directly from God, because that can't come from something that didn't have a soul. That had to come immediately from him because of the spiritual and infinite nature of what the soul is. The soul is immortal. Immortality can't come from something that isn't immortal. So those two things are super important. So the question, or Adam and Eve, cavemen, if by cavemen you mean just like the primitive man, like the first rational beings, then in a sense, yeah, what they look like, what they, we don't really know the specifics of that. But if by cavemen we mean like a pre-rational man, though that like if a Neanderthal would classify as that, though those technically weren't men. They weren't men and women. They weren't persons, because a person has a rational soul, and as soon as man can think and have an intellect, that's what makes him human. And that had to come directly from God. So how evolution was involved in that, there's lots of theories. And what did that particularly look like? There's lots of science that we're still unpacking it and trying to understand how did all this stuff come to be. But what we do know for sure is that God ultimately is the source. He created everything out of nothing. Everything always has to go back to this ultimate creator. And so even if he created something, then set it in motion and let it of its own power continue to grow and develop, that's certainly possible. It doesn't go against God being the ultimate creator, because he is the ultimate creator. But what's particularly important is that the soul, the rational soul that man has, we're the only creatures that have rational souls, that had to come from God. That couldn't just come out because the soul is infinite. The soul is immortal. It lasts forever. So those two things we know to be true. Everything around that, it's interesting stuff to read and to learn about. But so Adam and Eve were the first men. They were the first rational beings. So I know this is lots of big topics to talk about, but it's a great question and great stuff to think about. they started me off with a doozy. So I think that just about answers the question. The church has no kind of like official stance approving or denying evolution, just because it's a theory. It's not. It's things that we're still continuing to research and to learn about. But we're certainly open to science. The things that science can unlock to us about the mysteries of the world, we can learn from. There's a harmony between what the truths of the faith teach us and what science would reveal to us, because it's all truth, and truth isn't going to contradict itself. So the more that we're able to learn about these theories and these processes of how all this stuff came to be, I think the more it can shed light on how God worked and on the beauty of how God has set all this stuff into motion, because he is the ultimate source and he did it all for us. So that is, I think, the answer. So thanks for your questions. Continue to submit the questions. These are some of my favorite things to do, and I'm sure Father Bryce loves them as well. But that is it for this week's edition of Asked and Answered. So God bless y'all. Have a good night, and we're looking forward to seeing y'all soon.